My name is Andra. I'm a sales director at Permutive, and I am passionate about empowering advertisers to restore trust in digital advertising by using data responsibly. Today, I want to explore a slightly uncomfortable question with you. Is advertising the biggest data breach in history? Advertising, supported by ad tech, has had a huge influence over the internet as we know it today, underpinning so much free content for all of us to enjoy. And within ad tech, the proliferation, the explosion of third-party data over the past decade has had a huge influence with bringing more sophistication in terms of precision targeting and personalization with ad relevance. As consumers, advertisers, and publishers, we've all benefited in some way from the sheer number of data points available to us today. However, this model, which we call the open web, hasn't been without side effects. The reality is that the way in which we do audience activation at scale in programmatic has cost us, users, our privacy. And there's a couple of main concerns here that I wanted to surface today. The first one is around the fact that today there's hundreds, if not thousands, of companies that are collecting data on us, users. They're packaging this data, analyzing it, and in many cases, selling it on to other parties without our consent. So the first problem is around unconsented data. And then the way in which this data is shared amongst companies within the ad tech ecosystem is another issue, because it means that our personal data as users is in many cases broadcasted out to the entire ad tech ecosystem for these third-party companies to use. So essentially, this means that there's a huge data leakage with our personal data being shared with third-party companies that have no direct relationship to us, the user. And the numbers are shocking. In the US, your personal identity is exposed about 747 times a day with companies that you have no relationship with. In the UK, it's about half of that. And there's almost 5,000 companies that are allowed by Google to receive your data in the US. These are numbers revealed by the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, which is, interestingly, I think, a consumer-led organization. And they go as far as to say that this is the biggest data breach in history, third-party data enabled by ad tech. And what's really interesting to me is that consumers are now standing up for their rights, and they're saying this is not okay. There's all these companies using our data, and they need to take responsibility for the way in which this data is used. This has resulted in consumers losing trust in the ad tech industry, in the digital advertising industry. The reality is that most consumers, users, do not understand the nuts and bolts of the ad tech ecosystem, but today they just assume that their data is not used responsibly. In fact, almost 3/4 of consumers in the UK and in the US are now concerned. They're concerned about how brands are using their data in order to track them and target them with advertising online. And this has resulted in new regulations coming up, you're all familiar with, in Europe, in the US, and the big technology players, the likes of Apple and Google, introducing privacy changes in order to protect our privacy as consumers. From operating systems to browsers, we've seen it over the past few years. Actually, talking about Apple, I want to see some hands up for who's seen the latest ad that Apple put out there for protecting consumer privacy. The one with the data leakage, your data is being sold, the data auction. I see maybe 20 hands up, so I think most people have not seen it. Shall we watch it together? It's only 1 minute.
next sale is a digital treasure trove charming Ellie's private data. Lot number 1, her emails. The one she's opened and read, wonderfully personal. Let's start at 240, 260, 280. Sold. Lot number 2, Ellie's drugstore purchases. Voila, priceless data. Do I hear 480? 500. Sold. Her location data. It's not creepy, it's commerce. Do I hear 600, 620, 640, 660? Sold.
Nana?
All her contacts, even sweet Nana. Sold at 740. Her recent transactions. Her browsing history. Her late-night texting habit. Sold. And now the one you've all been waiting for, and I can promise you won't be disappointed.
Eye-opening, isn't it? When a brand like Apple goes to these lengths in order to ensure that all its users are aware of how their data is being used, and they're now in control, they can stop tracking by all these third-party companies that have no direct relationship with them. I think this sets a precedent. And I know that for marketers, this seems like a challenge because all the optimizations that we've built over the past decade have been using these third-party trackers. But I still think it is an opportunity. And it is an opportunity because this cycle of data breaches and privacy violations needs to stop. So it is clear that the open web must change in order to save the digital advertising ecosystem. What's needed is a replacement that's not based on third-party trackers and third-party data, but instead that's built on consent and trust, and still delivers on the convenience of audience targeting at scale, so as marketers, we can reach all the right customers with the relevant messages and deliver tailored consumer experiences. But we need to do this in a way that is based on consented data, that respects consumer privacy and choice, and that does not leak their personal data, our personal data, in the ecosystem through spreading all these persistent identifiers. So this is where the responsible web comes in. Now, as marketers and technology providers, we've got an opportunity. And that opportunity is to fundamentally change the way in which we do audience activation in programmatic so that it is based on trust and consented data. And in doing so, it's important that we do not replicate the mistakes from the past, and we do not try to put in place replica solutions for third-party cookies or third-party trackers, because these will not last. So what is the responsible web? It's an ecosystem that is based on accountability and responsibility, particularly when it comes to the collection, processing, and activation of consumer data. As a result, the responsible web is moving away from third-party data and third-party relationships and third-party trackers to first-party data and first-party relationships. Why first-party? Because first-party direct relationships provide the foundation for consented data and consumer trust. And in this new world, advertisers need to collaborate with publishers because they are the two endpoints that frame the digital advertising ecosystem. And in turn, they have direct relationships with their consumers and the users or the readers, and they can collaborate based on a fair value exchange in order to rebuild trust in the ecosystem. And since all good things come in three, these are our three core pillars for the responsible web. The first one is about consented data that is collected by first parties, the parties who have a direct relationship with the user. That is, the brands with their consumers and the publishers or the media owners with their users. And with first-party data that is responsibly sourced and used, advertisers can collaborate with publishers to drive audience insights and activation. The second pillar means that in the responsible web, hundreds of technology companies that you've never heard about can no longer act as controllers of your data. Instead, technology needs to act as infrastructure that supports processing of data. In short, technology should be an enabler and not an intermediary. And the last point is really around security by design. And one of the core principles of the responsible web is to minimize the use of identifiers in the bid stream, and instead leverage anonymous cohorts that are aggregated and keep data privacy safe. So, what is a cohort? Simply a group of people that share common characteristics. And here I want to do a little audience participation. Nothing scary, I promise. Can you put your hand up if you're interested in music? Okay. Maybe 60, 70% of the room. What about people who are interested in travel? Okay. And lastly, people keen on running. Slightly different group. Okay. Thank you for participating in that. I've seen quite a lot of overlap between those three cohorts, which just proves the point that as individuals, we're non-binary, we have multiple interests, we fall into multiple interest groups or cohorts, and our interests change all the time, every minute, every hour. What is important is that these behavioral traits are very relevant for advertisers and for publishers to deliver targeted campaigns. But what's really critical is that we don't need to know that it's Andra or Kate or James. Instead, it's an anonymous group of users who share common characteristics. And the really important thing about cohorts is that they enable us to do audience-led precision targeting in a way that does not rely on any individual user-level ID. They're ID-less, yet they enable precision targeting at scale. Therefore, they're not just privacy safe, but they're also future-proof. I want to close out by just summarizing why we, as marketers and tech providers, should act now and what we can do. Because this is not a future problem around what Google might do next and when, or about third-party cookies. I think this is fundamentally a problem around consumer trust, and the fact that consumer trust in the digital advertising industry has been broken. So we, as marketers and technology providers, need to work together to rebuild trust in digital advertising. And in doing so, it's really important that we do not replicate the mistakes from the past. So it's time to join the responsible web. But as an advertiser, you might be wondering what's in it for you. Well, you get access to an infrastructure that enables collaboration with publishers so that you can access publisher cohorts based on publisher-consented first-party data, or you can also bring on your own first-party data to match it in a safe way with publishers through matched and model cohorts. So you can get addressability at scale through cohorts while keeping data safe and never leaking personal identifiers in the bid stream. And so we can rebuild trust in digital advertising by using data responsibly. I think it's time to join the responsible web, and I'm inviting all of you to do that with us. If you want to find out more about Permutive, the responsible web, cohort-based activation, and how we do that, please drop by our stand, which is in C2 Cabana, just outside here on the right, further down. Thank you so much for your time today.
Andra, thank you so much. Great talk. Loads of questions, but just to use time, I'm going to pick one that I really like.
Okay.
So it's from Anonymous again. You show first-party data as the solution, but with brands addicted to paid media and often lacking any scalable means of first-party data integration, it's a nice phrase coming up, is there a first-party data crisis?
Really good question. I think when we say first-party data, normally we think about advertiser first-party data, maybe your CRM lists, your sales data. And we know that for some brands, it is easier to collect that data because they have a direct relationship with the consumer, for example, retailers. If you look at CPG brands, for example, they don't have a direct relationship with the consumer, so it's harder for them to do that. You know, with the privacy changes, we're hearing a lot of talk about the importance to build your first-party data strategy, which we absolutely support, but the reality is that it's not easy to do that for all brands. Some brands, like CPG brands, for example, are limited. So I think this is where publisher first-party data comes in, because publishers have a wealth of consented first-party data, whether it is authenticated or anonymous, behavioral, interest, affinity, and they can work together with advertisers in order to complete or enrich, enhance their first-party data. So I think there's definitely value in that publishers can bring with their own data.
Andra, excellent talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.